بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya, we are continuing to look after the chapters that summarize the rulings on i'rab and bina, on some of the supplementary investigations on and we looked at a number of important sub-chapters that arise. Today we're looking at al-mu'arrafu bil-adat, right? The definite article, right? Bil-adat ay bi-adat al-ta'rif. And so the author of the Mutammima says, فصل وأما المعرف بالأداء, as for that which is in the in the definite through an adat, through a through the adat of ta'rif, فهو المعرف بالألف واللام. It is that which is in the definite through the alif and lam. كالرجل والغلام, like الرجل and الغلام. We've taken this before, that there are broadly three opinions on what is the adat, the instrument of ta'rif. Is it the alif? Is it alif and lam? Do you call it al-alifi wal lam, or is it al, or is it the lam? Right? Right? And this is discussed a little bit in the commentary for those who would like to look at that, but we talked about it previously as well. Then, of course, classification is according to consideration. So then he'll tell us that there's two types of al. Some mention three, because some mentions that there is jins, istighraq, and ahad. Right? Because there's categorical, encompassing, and ahad. But it's a matter of how you break it down. Because jins, categorical, can be two types. One, either you consider the category per se, insan, or you consider all the individuals in the category, meaning all people, right? But let's see. So he says, وهي قسمان عهدية وجنسية. It's referential or categorical. And each of these has, in his classification, got three subcategories underneath. والعهدية للعهد الذكري نحو قوله سبحانه وتعالى. What is the example? Can you read it out? Well, sorry? Right? في زجاجة الزجاجة. Right? So, from Surah An-Nur, المصباح فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة. The misbah, is it part of the example in your copy? No, okay. Right? Of course, both are it applies to both. فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة. Right? المصباح, right? It's للعهد. And it's called العهد الذكري. It's referential. And what is it referring to? لشيء مذكور لشيء مذكور قبله. It was already mentioned. في مصباح يعني في مصباح. المصباح أي مصباح؟ المصباح المذكور. Right? في زجاجة الزجاجة أي زجاجة؟ الزجاجة المذكورة. Right? Right? And the next example? Is there another example? Okay. In the commentary, he mentions a third example from Surah Al-Muzammil, verses 15-16. كما أرسلنا إلى فرعون رسولا. Right? Indefinite. فعصى فرعون الرسول. فعصى فرعون الرسول. فعصى فرعون الرسول. أي رسول عصى؟ الرسول المذكور. Right? الرسول. Okay. So why would it just say, put it in the definite? Right? أرسلنا إلى فرعون رسولا. You could just say أرسلنا إلى فرعون موسى. Right? Because the focus isn't on simply, the point isn't the person as insofar as they're a person. A person was sent to him. But the role of Sayyidina Musa is being emphasized, right? أرسلنا إلى فرعون رسولا. الرسول يعني من يحمل رسالة يؤديها نيابة عن المرسل. Right? That the Rasul, you can say, is an emissary, is someone who bears a critical message. Right? Right? From someone who sent. Right? Like kings send a Rasul, right? It's an emissary. It's almost like an ambassador, right? It's an emissary. Right? So they bear a message from one great, and they convey it on behalf of the one who sent them. Rasula, and it's in the indefinite للتفخيم. Right? فعصى فرعون الرسول. Right? Fir'aun did not obey just, a man from Bani Israel. So Fir'aun الرسول. Right? هذا الرسول المعهود, who is, with the meanings of it, right? So this is okay, Bismillah. It's not a tafsir. Okay. So this is one type of ahad, and these should be diagrammed, and ideally before. Al is lil ahad or lil jins. And the ahad is either dhihni, is dhikri, or أو للعهد أو للعهد الذهني. Right? Right? It's referential to something that would be understood in the mind. It's not mentioned before, but when mentioned, it would be understood. Right? إِذْ هُمَا فِي الْغَارِ. Right? When they were in the cave. No cave has been mentioned before. Right? Regarding Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Right? because it's known. Right? So what's the example here? What's the example given? للعهد الذهني إذ هما في الغار. Right? Right? Or let's say, two people show up to work in the morning, and one person's eyes are closed because they're just waiting for the first customer. And you say, جاء المشتري. Which mushtari? The one we are expecting, the first one. And we were not talking about anybody. Two people showed up, they opened the store. Right? جاء الزبون. Right? Right? المشتري, let's put it in. Yeah. More obvious. Fusha. Right? Which zabun? We weren't talking about him. Right? But we're kind of expecting them. The customer has come. Which one? That's in our mind. The customer. We were waiting for the first comer. So then, Farid sits up and service with a smile begins, right? Okay. أو للعهد الحضوري. Right? Right? And some distinguish between العهد الذهني and الحضوري, and some don't. Right? So sometimes you'll see the ahad is of two types, ahad ذهني and ذكري and ذهني. Some put the third, which is أو للعهد الحضوري نحو اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم. اليوم أي اليوم الحاضر. Right? On this day. Literally اليوم, the day. But for الحاضر it's this day. Right? So this is للعهد. And the second type of is والجنسية إما لتعريف الماهية. What's the example, Omar? وجعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي, from Surah Al-Anbiya. Right? Right? وجعلنا من الماء. من الماء, this is للماهية, from that thing called water. Right? So it's لل من حقيقته. Right? Right? So الماهية is a technical term. It's not something the classical Arabs used per se. الماهية هو ما يجاوب به عن الشيء. عن سؤال ما هو. Right? Right? So if someone asks ما هو, الجواب عن ما هو هذا الشيء, the answer is the ماهية. Right? It's reality. Okay? And there's terms for this in English. We don't need to worry about those. Okay. كل شيء حي. وجعلنا من الماء. So this is not from all water, right? But from that thing called water. That. So this is one type of وإما لاستغراق الأفراد. لاستغراق الأفراد. Sorry, I've got some funny errors here. وإما لاستغراق الأفراد, or استغرق, غرق is to drown. استغرق is something that takes something up completely. يعني هذه الوظيفة استغرقت كل الوقت. It took up, it has the idea of taking up fully. Because when you drown, the water takes you up fully. Right? So it's استغرق, it takes over. وإما لاستغراق الأفراد نحو قوله سبحانه وتعالى. What's the example, Sayyid Hamza? خلق الإنسان ضعيفا. خلق الإنسان. Right? So what is meant here? The al here is للاستغراق. Right? All humans have been created weak. Right? So referring to the category insofar as it encompasses all of them. Right? But one of the differences between the al that is لتعريف الماهية, like in the first case, and the al that is للاستغراق, is al of the mahiyya. This defines the identity of the thing itself. So an exception can't be made from it. Right? Right? So you say, if you were to say, for example, so you couldn't make an exception. Right? Whereas the al that is للاستغراق, you could make an exception. Right? So use the example, it's in the commentary. Right? وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. Right? الْإِنسان لَفِي خُسْرٍ. So the al here is not the mahiyya, that is not the nature of man that he's in loss, but that all people are in loss. Right? So it's استغراق الأفراد. Right? Because the first one, the al is, it defines the nature of something, right? It's referring, it is the nature of water, right? From that, it's water, from that thing that is water. So that thing, you cannot make an exception from it. But when you consider a category insofar as all its particulars, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. So the al here is what? لجنس الإنسان. But what type of jins? استغراق. All people are in loss. إلا, because you said all, so you could make an exception. But خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, the human being has been created weak. Not insofar as all humans have been created weak, but that is the nature of man, is the mahiyya. Why? خُلِقَ ضَعِيفًا, why? And there's a whole bunch of, that's one of the things that the ulama mentioned to reflect upon, because they say, it's come from the early Muslims, and it's words so wise that many consider them to be hadith, but it's not a hadith. But the only reason it was ascribed as being a hadith because it is so wise, which is Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu. Whoever knows themselves knows their Lord. Right? And it became famous as being from the words of Yahya bin Mu'adh al-Razi, as mentioned by a number of those who've talked about al-ahadith التي اشتهرت على الألسنة. But others disagree with that, and if you want to investigate, there's a work by Shaykh Ahmad ibn Siddiq al-Ghumari, who does a takhrij of the hadith of Awarif al-Ma'arif, and he has a discussion on this hadith. But he doesn't give a concluding argument why it's someone else's words, but man arafa nafsahu. One of the ways to know oneself is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Quran is telling us about Himself. But throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about the human being. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. What else is mentioned about the human being? وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ أَكْثَرَ شَيْءٍ جَدَلًا. What else? They're ajul. Right? وَتُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَةِ. You love the immediate. Countless things are mentioned about the human being. Okay? Some of them are from the nature of man, and some of them are the general case. Right? Like, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. But we don't study grammar for the purpose of sophistication. We study it because these things give us tools. We recite in the Quran, we say, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. Which kind of L is this? So we can reflect. And of course, don't go around making ijtihad. These things we can, that's why we have the books of tafsir. And that's where the value of the tafasir al-lughawiyya are. Because they guide us through these kinds of pathways, right? وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. Right, that is now, of course, some of them they can be difference. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. The ulama would خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. There would be some discussion. Is this from this? What do we mean by ضعف? Right? Because a case can be made that كون الإنسان ضعيفا خُلِقَ الإنسان ضعيفا could be for the mahiyya. Right? Why? من لا وجود لذاته من ذاته فوجوده لولاه عين محال. أنتم الفقراء. That anyone who does not have existence for themselves from themselves, then their existence were not for Allah is absurdity itself. Right? So it's ضعف. It's from its iftiqar. أنتم الفقراء إلى الله. Right? If the iftiqar of the human being is dhati, is essential. So in that sense, right, the existential weakness of the human being could be argued that it's لتعريف الماهية. Right? But the ضعف, yeah, so there's some discussion on that example. But you can find many other examples of that. I don't know if the author of the Kawakib goes into it, but this example has been discussed. Right? وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. Right? 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 That's an example of an exception made. أو لاستغراق خصائص you have أفراد, right? Sorry. أو لاستغراق خصائص الأفراد. The third type of L is لاستغراق خصائص الأفراد. Right? And this is done for مبالغة, is to encompass the distinguishing qualities of an individual. Right? مبالغة. Right? نحو أنت الرجل علما. You're the man. Right? Like they say. Right? Doesn't mean that you define what man is. Right? And it doesn't mean you are all people. But أنت الرجل علما. Right? Right? So as Al-Faki says, أي أنت كل رجل علما بمعنى أنك اجتمع فيك ما افترق في غيرك من الرجال من جهة كمالك في العلم. Right? 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 It's like right? And there is some discussion about this. Some refer to two types of L. Because this is a less common usage. Don't go around saying this daily. Right? Broadly, you have or of jins, right? Is for either the thing itself, it's just referring to the category, or to which is لتعريف الماهية or للاستغراق. And sometimes they refer to the لتعريف الماهية, they refer to that as al-jins, insofar as you're talking about the category as category, not all the particulars. Okay. The third one, this is a use for mubalagha. Right? And then وتبدل ميما في لغة حمير. Right? And my friend read this in class as Hamir. Shaykh Abdurrahman Kharsa thought that was hilarious. So والله ما لهم حمير, ناس كرام من العرب. Right? Because Himyar is one of the قبائل of the Arab, but Hamir is plural of Himar. Right? And they're not, they're a noble tribe. Right? So تبدل يعني تبدل أي لام ال المعرفة. Right? As Al-Faki, he tells us. Right? And does he give an example? Yeah. So in the Sharh, he mentions وقد نطق النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بها بهذه اللغة. Right? Right? And this is mentioned, right? The hadith is related in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and the Sunan of النسائي, right? فقال عليه الصلاة والسلام ليس من البر أم صيام فم سفر. Right? So they asked him, and they say, some narrations mention that Sayyidina Abu Bakr was, he was asked, هل من البر أم صيام فم سفر. Sayyidina Abu Bakr looked at the Prophet because he was confused, like what just took place. He was not used to this lugha. And the strange, and one of the amazing things about it is that Sayyidina Abu Bakr was distinguished for his knowledge of the qaba'il and the ansab of the Arab. Right? That he was known amongst the Arabs, particularly amongst Quraysh, who were like the people of knowledge of the Arabs. He knew the qaba'il and the lineages of the Arabs. He was surprising. Right? Because many dialects, it would appear that when they would come to Mecca, frequently they would speak in the sort of the common tongue, so to speak, was Lughat Quraysh, right? Because that's, it was there for, because of the role that Mecca, the Kaaba and Mecca played, and Quraysh as the custodians. But the Prophet ﷺ then responded, لَيْسَ مِنَ الْبِرِّ أَمْ صِيَامُ فِي سَفَرٍ. He responded this person from Himyar in his tongue. And it's also said that it's from the lugha of Tay. Right? So this is the al al-ta'rif. It's quite straightforward, right? The al makes something definite. It's either lil-ahad, which are referential, which are dhikri, dhihni, and huduri. And the huduri is less frequent. The most commonly referred to are dhihni and dhikri. Or it's lil jins, which is either للماهية أو لاستغراق الأفراد or استغراق خصائص الأفراد. Right? And the third one here again is less common. أنت الرجل علما. Right? As if you have all knowledge of people, and compared to you, others have no knowledge. Right? And mubalagha is from rhetoric when used right. Right? 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 Okay. Right? It's like Shaykh Abdurrahman al-Shaghuri says, يا أيها المختار يا باهي السنة من ذا الذي مثلك للحسن قد احتوى بعض المحاسن منك قد منح الورى أيصح إثبات المحاسن للسوى. يا أيها المختار, O chosen one, يا باهي السنة, O dazzling of radiant beauty. Right? من ذا الذي للحسن مثلك قد احتوى. Who is there who encompasses beauty as you do? بعض المحاسن منك قد منح الورى. Some of your beautiful qualities, the rest of creation, were granted. أيصح إثبات المحاسن للسوى. But in truth, is it possible? أيصح, is it valid to affirm beauty or virtue to any other? Right? So that's, so emphatic affirmation sometimes entails the use of these tools, right? But it's not something you can use day to day. Then he says, المضاف إلى واحد من المعارف الخمس. He says, فصل وأما المضاف إلى واحد من هذه الخمس. Right? As for something that's in idafa to one of these 5 things. Right? فنحو غلامي وغلامك وغلام هذا وغلام الذي قام أبوه وغلام الرجل. So غلامي, this is مضاف إلى ضمير المتكلم. غلامك مضاف إلى العلم. غلام هذا مضاف إلى اسم الإشارة. غلام الذي قام أبوه مضاف إلى الموصول. And غلام الرجل المضاف إلى المعرف بال. Right? So because إضافة is من أسباب التعريف as well. Right? Right? And then you have المرفوعات من الأسماء. Right? So now we're getting back to the core investigations of the Ajrumiyya itself. So these supplementary chapters have many points of benefit that one should consolidate, because if you wouldn't have covered them in the Ajrumiyya directly fully, but these are also very useful to, like when you are reviewing the Ajrumiyya, to know these extra chapters that we looked at. They're all, they have a lot of points of benefit related to things that will come before and they also are very useful on their own to what comes after, right? So if you have a mental map, what are the things that distinguish the Mutammima? This is one of the things that distinguishes the Mutammima. These Zawa'idul Mutammima, right? And the ulama would write books of Zawa'id, and these are always very useful. Right? So, and someone would do a good job by keeping track of the Zawa'idul Mutammima. Al-Marfu'atu min al-Asma'. And of course, in the science of hadith, the Zawa'id became a science unto themselves. So, individual ulama would take a hadith collection, and a lot of hadith are related everywhere. But what's really important is, like, if you know the main hadiths, what are the extra hadiths in this book? So a number of people worked on this. So for example, Imam Nuruddin al-Haythami with a tha, right? He did a number of works, culminating in his work where he looked at the most important works outside the Kutub al-Sitta, the most important works of hadith outside the 6 books, and he wrote a book called Majma'u al-Zawa'id, the compendium of the extra hadiths. These are hadiths related in a large number of major hadith collections, including notable works like the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, etc., but that are not mentioned in the Kutub al-Sitta: Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah. And it's very useful, right? And it's a brilliant work. And he actually does a top-level assessment of the strength of the hadiths. And sometimes ulama did it for just personal testing. So the great Sudanese Hanafi scholar, Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubugha, he did the Zawa'id of Ad-Daraqutni over the 6 books from memory. That's quite a brilliant feat, if you imagine, right? So you go through Ad-Daraqutni, any hadith that is already in the 6 books, you don't mention it. You just gather the hadiths that are only in Daraqutni, that are not in there. And that's very useful for multiple reasons, right? That you're already familiar with these, now you want the extra hadith. It's a very useful art, and there's ulama of hadith who are doing that. Even in our time, someone compiled, for example, Zawa'id al-Adab al-Mufrad, the hadiths that are in al-Adab al-Mufrad that are not in the 6 major hadith collections. And that's very useful, because many people will study Riyadh al-Salihin, they'll study Mishkat al-Masabih, these other works that gather primarily the hadiths in the 6 books, but there's a whole set of hadiths in Al-Adab al-Mufrad of one of the secondary works of Imam al-Bukhari, the author of the Sahih, and these are just the unique hadiths in it. So it's a useful science. Anyways, Bismillah. Returning back to normal operations and what's within the Ajrumiyya itself, he talks about al-marfu'atu min al-asma'. باب المرفوعات من الأسماء. Now, of course, there's an interesting thing that to consider. Something that rafa, the maf'ul of rafa is marfu', right? So why does it take a feminine plural, right? Right? Because the sifa of mudhakkar la ya'qil, right? but because it's a sifa of al-asma, because it's originally al-asma al-marfu'at or al-asma al-marfu'a. So al-marfu'atu min al-asma, right? Originally al-asma al-marfu'a, right? But the focus isn't that they're ism, but that they are marfu'. So you took the sifa and you put it before, right? So that's why it's marfu'at. Anyways, al-marfu'atu 10. المرفوعات 10. The marfu', the asma that are in rafa are 10. So what does he do? He first lists them and then he'll go one by one. And he begins with the rafa because it's the rafa يختص بالعمد, with the pillars of a sentence. Right? So they're the most important. وهي, what are they? Asi Zain, could you read? واسم كان و which is it? Is it واسم كان و good, right?
واسم أفعال المقاربة واسم الحروف المشبهة بليس وخبر إن وأخواتها وخبر للتي لنفي الجنس والتابع للمرفوع وهو 4 أشياء: النعت والعطف والتوكيد والبدل.
Yeah, good. Okay, so the marfu'at are, how many does he mention in the Ajrumiyya? What did he say? 7. Right? Correct? So he adds a couple. Again, here it's good to note what things he added. What does he add here? Yeah, so he introduces here, you need the af'alul muqaraba, and واسم الحروف المشبهة بليس, like ما زيد قائما, right? For example, and خبر of لا لنفي الجنس, right? يعني لا رجل أفضل من زيد, for example, as the commentator mentions, right? So these are 10. There's 3 extra, and it's good to keep these in mind. Now those 3 are, well, some of them, like there's reasons why Ibn Ajurrum rahimahullah did not mention them. الحروف المشبهة بأفعال المقاربة كاد زيد يقوم, right? Because these are more technical, حروف المشبهة بليس, etc., and we'll be touching upon them, right? And we're not going to go into it, but the commentator mentions, and the reason the ulama across the sciences pay emphasis to this is not just takalluf, although a lot of times students think about it, but order arises from principle. Right? That someone who's thinking correct would put something in right order. Right? So if there's discernible order, it means that there's reasoning behind it. Right? So here he mentions why he mentions it in this order. He mentions وَقَدَّمَ الْفَاعِل, why he mentioned the fa'il, and there's reasoning behind it. Right? And this is an assumption of any sane action. right? Any rational action. And someone who just goes in any random order, it's like that's the time to switch to small talk, right? كيف الحال كيف الأولاد يعني well, if where applicable, right, etc. So then he says الفاعل, right? الباب الأول باب الفاعل. And the Mutammima, because it is built on the Ajrumiyya, Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya, he broadly sticks to the definitions of the Ajrumiyya. Even where there are issues with the definition of the Ajrumiyya, the biggest objection that one can make to the definitions of the Ajrumiyya is the biggest objection, even more important than that. Because descriptive definition is not a problem. Okay? There's two types of definitions. There's hadd and rasm. Right? There is a there's a definition that's تعريف الشيء بماهيته, right? That's the hadd, right? Or there's تعريف الشيء بأوصافه. That's rasm. And there, both hadd and rasm are tam or naqis, and we'll be seeing that in mantiq. That's not fundamentally a problem. It's better, generally better to define with a hadd, and from the hadd to define it with a hadd tam. But there could be a reason, right? Like, what city were you in? We're in Geneva itself? What is Geneva? Tell me about Geneva. You give me just a definition of Geneva. Sometimes I'm not looking for a definition. I know what Geneva is. Like, describe it to me, right? For example, if I were going there, right? So sometimes a descriptive definition is what's being sought or what is praiseworthy, right? Right? Like, imagine someone's from Maidan. So أخبرني عن Maidan. Say, Maidan is a part of Damascus that, though originally not part of the old quarters of Damascus that were covered by the walls of Damascus, but has come to be considered from old Damascus. Yeah, that's descriptive, right? But that's one type of description. But sometimes Maidan is a part of Damascus. And you wanted to know, like, tell me about, your time there. Yeah. وعندنا من جملة المردود أن تدخل أو تدرج الأحكام في الحدود, or whatever the author of السلم المنورق said. And according to us, according to the scholars of logic, from the things that are rejected, meaning with respect to definitions, is that rulings be inserted into definitions. Why? Because the الحكم على الشيء فرع عن تصوره. A ruling on something is derivative of first soundly conceiving of it. What does a definition do? The definition is what helps you conceive of something. So if you say زيد قائم, من زيد هو القائم, right? That's circularity, right? Because a ruling is something affirmed about a matter. So to say Zayd is standing, if we put the ruling into the definition of Zayd, you have circularity there, right? So if you say al-fa'ilu huwa al-ismu al-marfu', dot dot dot, but then we say, okay, but we would say, saying al-fa'ilu marfu'un. This is a statement, right? You have musnad and musnad ilayhi. We have ascribed rafa to the ism. So I say, okay, let me to the fa'il. So what is فما هو الفاعل؟ الفاعل هو الاسم المرفوع. So therefore, if you break that down, I'm saying الفاعل مرفوع. ما هو الفاعل؟ الفاعل هو الاسم المرفوع. That's either redundant or circular. So it's not acceptable, right? Right? So you couldn't define salah, for example, right, as عبادة مفروضة تجب كل يوم خمس مرات. Right? It's an act of worship that is obligatory. Why? Because the hukum, as-salatu fard, is a matter that is affirmed for this act, the prayer. So you can't insert the ruling into it, because first you have to conceive of a thing, then you affirm a ruling for it. However, sometimes it can be very practical, right? Because the mahiyya, the reality of something, tends to be subtle, especially of meanings, tangible things, right? But a fa'il, it's a meaning. To understand meanings, it requires a certain depth of understanding. The beginner does not have that depth necessarily. So al-fa'ilu, so this is excusable min bab at-ta'lim, but within the level of the mubtadi', the beginner. But if we get to an intermediate level, these are not acceptable definitions at that level. They're suitable for the mubtadi', but when one gets to an intermediate level, and this is from the alamat, as the author of the Mutammima mentions in the beginning, that this text is designed to be a bridge to the intermediate level texts. It's not. The Mutammima completes the beginner stage with solid consolidation, but it's not an intermediate level book, even though it encompasses much of what's needed in grammar. Okay. So الفاعل هو الاسم المرفوع, right? المذكور قبله فعل أو ما في تأويل فعل. What's changed here? What's mentioned in the Ajrumiyya itself? المذكور قبله فعله, right? There he says هو الاسم, the fa'il is the ism, المرفوع المذكور قبله فعله, right? أو ما في تأويل الفعل, or that which is akin to the fi'l, or that which is interpreted as being like a fi'l, which is things like ism al-fa'il and as-sifa al-mushabbaha and the masdar, right, which we will be seeing in a minute, right? 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 And some include هو الاسم الصريح أو المؤول, right? And those things will come later, but you can, if you want to dig, there's some interesting investigations there. وهو على قسمين. The فاعل is of two types. ظاهر ومضمر. What's the example he gives us? قال الله, right? Right? So the fa'il is لفظ الجلالة Allah, right? يعني هو الاسم المرفوع المذكور قبله فعله. The فعل is, right? Then قال رجلان, right? So here he's going through the different types of rafa, because the rafa could be with dhamma, it could be with an alif, or give other examples. Those who express their عذر, their excuses, from Surah At-Tawbah. The example of al-marfu' bil-waw, dhamma waw alif noon, gives an example of alif, قال رجلان, waw, al-mu'adhdhirun, right? And then يوم يقوم الناس, right? So because it can be madi or mudari'. So you see, the author of Mutammima has broken it down mentally. He doesn't tell you what his structure is, but he breaks it down that the fa'il, what puts it in rafa, the fi'l could be madi or mudari'. He gives three examples of the madi first, then he gives you examples of the mudari' without stating that he structured it in this way. But he doesn't just give three random examples. Right? That's structured reasoning. Some structures are explicit. They say 1, 2, 3, they'll tell you explicitly. This is the nature of structured reasoning. And how does that come? It comes through training. It comes through training. But one needs to practice that in anything you write, you speak, structure. Right. يوم يقوم. So now these are the examples of the fi'l al-mudari'. The fa'il whose raf'a is through a fi'l mudari'. يوم يقوم الناس. So the example is, of course, الناس. يقوم الزيدان. ويومئذ يفرح المؤمنون. Right? Right? So المؤمنون, and the fi'l that's raf'at for it is a mudari', يفرح, right, from Surah Al-Rum. Right? And the next example, قال أبوهم, from Surah Yusuf. Right? Example of the Asma' al-Sitta. Right? And then, what's the next example? Yeah. So these are examples of the sarih. Right? The commentator adds an example of al-mu'awwal bis-sarih. ألم يأن للذين آمنوا أن تخشع قلوبهم لذكر الله. And you can read about it in the commentary if you're given to some thinking. That's an amazing set of verses from Surah Al-Hadid. Many people become Muslims through that verse. I actually used to have a shortcut for it. Because often when people would ask about, I'm thinking about being Muslim and so on, right? So you have three questions. You do believe in God, yes. You believe that the Prophet Muhammad is a messenger of God. Say yes. That what he's come with is true. Say yes. So you're already a believer. And then you quote and then that verse, أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ. Has the time not come for those who believe? لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, for those who have believed. أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُم, that their hearts be humbled. ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, to the remembrance of Allah and what has come of the truth. Right? Because أن تخشع is what? Looks like يعني ألم يأني للذين آمنوا خشوع قلوبهم. Right? And we'll see that when we come to the what is in the ta'wil of the fi'l. Okay. والمضمر, and what's the example of the mudmar? Right? نحو قولك. Omar, could you read? Right? So he doesn't go into all of them, right? نحو ضربت, ضربنا, and the rest as has come in the section on the mudmarat. So he abridges, like he does in a few places, from the original. And then he says والذي في تأويل الفعل. Right? So we'll stop there. We'll look at this. Okay, Bismillah, and then we'll see. So he says والذي في تأويل الفعل نحو أقائم الزيدان. Right? قائم, right, is like قائم is like saying يقوم. Is, right? An example from the Quran is مختلف ألوانه, أي يختلف أو تختلف ألوانه. Right? So قائم الزيداني is like saying, so قائم is في تأويل يقوم, and زيدان is فاعل by this. And he leaves it at this level of detail. Right? So you put a placeholder there, right? Like you put a post note in, like a post-it note, details forthcoming, and there's a stamp, right? And this can be unsatisfying at one level, and I'd like to know more about it, and if one would, فإذا ما شئت أدِ الثمن. If you seek, then pay the price. Right? So this is that which is in the ta'wil of the fi'l, and you can find the details a little more about this in like Sharh Qatr al-Nada and elsewhere, but he just gives you this. وَلِلْفَاعِلِ أَحْكَامٌ. The fa'il has ahkam, right? And he points to mentioning some of them. And minha, this min is of tab'id, which is why the commentator says للفاعل أحكام أي كثيرة, has many rulings. He'll mention some of them. منها أنه لا يجوز حذفه. It is not valid to omit it. لأنه عمدة, right? Because it's a pillar of the sentence. ولا يجوز حذف العمد. And the khilaf about this is weak, you can see, right? Then what does he say? فإن ظهر في اللفظ. Okay, فإن ظهر في اللفظ نحو قائم زيد والزيدان قام فذاك واضح. Right? Sometimes the فاعل is ظاهر, right? And it's واضح, that's clear, it does not require. وإلا يظهر فهو ضمير مستتر. But sometimes it's not explicit, and in that case it would be a ضمير and it's hidden. نحو زيد قام. زيد قام. What's the فاعل there? No. Right? Because what is the definition of the فاعل? والاسم المرفوع المذكور قبله فعله. لا الفاعل لا يتقدم على الفعل. So the إعراب of زيد قام is زيد is مبتدأ, قام is, so زيد is مبتدأ. قام is like you put square brackets here, you put round brackets here, right? قام is فعل, and what's the فاعل? هو, right? And this جملة of فعل فاعل is in the place of the khabar of the mubtada, which is Zayd. Right? So قام هو, right? And that connects the two. ومنها أنه لا يجوز تقدمه على الفعل، أي أنه لا يجوز تقدم الفاعل على الفعل. فإن وجد ما ظاهره أنه فاعل مقدم وجب تقدير الفاعل ضميرا مستترا ويكون المقدم إما مبتدأ نحو زيد قام وإما فاعلا بفعل محذوف. And what's the example? Does he give the example? وإن أحد من المشركين استجارك. Right? Okay. So it's not permitted for the fa'il to precede the fi'l. And if it appears to be the case that the fa'il is first and the fi'l, then it's grammatically understood that there's a dhamir mustatir that connects them. And what came before is either mubtada, Zaydun qama. So Zayd is mubtada, qama fi'l, its fa'il is dhamirul mustatir, taqdiruhu huwa. And this jumla of the fi'l and fa'il is fi mahal rafa khabar for the mubtada, which is Zayd, or fa'il bi fi'l mahdhuf, right? As in the second example. وإن أحد, أحد is فاعل لفعل محذوف تفسيره مذكور يفسره المذكور. وإن أحد استجارك إيه؟ وإن استجارك أحد, right? And that, because the fa'il can be sometimes implicit, and that sometimes comes up in conditional statements. Why is it mahdhuf? Because there's so that there isn't redundancy. ومنها, so we'll stop there inshallah. ومنها أن فعله يوحد, right? So we'll stop there and continue بإذن الله تعالى, because he expands the fa'il quite a bit. Why? Because it's one of the umad of the sentence, right? And then we get to the lugha of أكلوني البراغيث, which is really cool, right? 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 And we'll see أكلوني البراغيث, because the basis is that it be أكلني البراغيث. But there's a lugha of the Arabs where they said that. What's a burghouth? Like one of these, what's a baraghith? They're like, it's a fly that bites you, right? So we look at that, but we'll stop there. Because he goes into, but that's more rare. This lughat akaluni al-baraghith, and then so there's a few other ahkam. So looking, some of them are core rulings, like the most, this the الفعل لا يتقدم على الفاعل لا يتقدم على الفعل, etc. But there's secondary ones that are also important to be aware of. And then there's exceptions, which are rare, but and one of the reasons they're the most important reason why it's an exception we mentioned is that if it's in the Quran or it's in the Hadith, right? Or it's in secondary usage of the Arabs, which is useful either to understand classical poetry or classical literature of the Islamic period, or to understand pre-Islamic poetry, because pre-Islamic poetry gives insight into the language of the Quran, right? As Ibn Abbas would say, if you're unclear about something in the Quran, then refer to the poetry of the Arabs. فَإِنَّ الشِّعْرَ دِيوَانُ الْعَرَبِ, right? Because poetry is the compendium of the Arabs. Right? So he was asked, and this is an example of ta'wil of the Sahaba. It says, يَوْمَ يُكْشَفُ عَنْ سَاقٍ, when on the day when the shin is uncovered, and they'll be called to prostrate. So the Sahaba didn't understand. So Ibn Abbas was asked, what is meant by that? Of course, some literalists say, and they actually, like there's one like modern day living literalist who's published at least 2 books, في إثبات صفة الساق, to establish the divine attribute of the shin. 2 treatises. Like, I haven't read either one, I just saw something about it. Besides YouTube videos and articles, and it's like he's infatuated with his deluded, imagined divine shin. But it's authentically established from Ibn Abbas that the Arabs, it's that when the battle or the fitna would become intense, the Arabs would raise their garment to be able to either to attack or flee. So the shins would get either they would raise them to be able to attack or flee, or in their attacking or fleeing, the shins would get uncovered. Right? So it refers to a day of great turmoil. It's not that that's but that's an example, and Ibn Abbas quoted from some pre-Islamic references related to that, right? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.